Hi, my name is Sarah Fade of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 22 in our History Bites series. Today we will discuss the consequential life of Martin Luther King Jr. and how he became one of the most renowned civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, the second child of Martin Luther King Sr., a pastor, and Alberta Williams King, a former schoolteacher. Along with his older sister Christine and younger brother Alfred Daniel Williams, he grew up in the city's Sweet Auburn neighborhood, then home to some of the most prominent and prosperous African Americans in the country. King attended segregated public schools and at the age of 15 was admitted to Morehouse College, the alma mater of both his father and maternal grandfather, where he studied medicine and law. Although he had not intended to follow in his father's footsteps by joining the ministry, he changed his mind under the mentorship of Morehouse's president, Dr. Benjamin Mays, an influential theologian and outspoken advocate for racial equality. After graduating in 1948, King entered Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he thrived in his studies and was valedictorian of his class in 1951. And elected student body president. He earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree, won a prestigious fellowship for graduate study, and was elected president of his predominantly white senior class. King then enrolled in a graduate program at Boston University, completing his coursework in 1953 and earning a doctorate in systematic theology 2 years later. While in Boston, he met Coretta Scott, a young singer from Alabama who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. The couple wed in 1953 and settled in Montgomery, Alabama, where King became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The King family had been living in Montgomery for less than a year when the highly segregated city became the epicenter of the growing struggle for civil rights in America. On December 1st of 1955, Rosa Parks, secretary of the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery bus and was arrested. Activists coordinated a bus boycott that would continue for 381 days. The Montgomery bus boycott placed a severe economic strain on the public transit system and downtown business owners. Martin Luther King Jr. was named as the protest leader and official spokesman. In January 1957, King, Ralph Abernathy, and 60 ministers and civil rights activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to harness the moral authority and organizing power of black churches. They would help conduct nonviolent protests to promote civil rights reform. The organization felt the best place to start to give African Americans a voice was to enfranchise them in the voting process. In February of 1958, the SCLC sponsored more than 20 mass meetings in key southern cities to register black voters in the South. King met with religious and civil rights leaders and lectured all over the country on race-related issues. King had also become a target for white supremacists who firebombed his family home that January. On September 20th, 1958, Izola Ware Curry walked into a Harlem department store where King was signing books and asked, "Are you Martin Luther King?" When he replied yes, she stabbed him in the chest with a knife. King survived, and the attempted assassination only reinforced his dedication to nonviolence. The experience of these last few days has deepened my faith in the relevance of the spirit of nonviolence. If necessary, social change is peacefully to take place. In February 1960, a group of African American students in North Carolina began what became known as the Greensboro Sit-In Movement. The students would sit at racially segregated lunch counters in the city stores. When asked to leave or sit in the colored section, they just remained seated, subjecting themselves to verbal and sometimes physical abuse. The movement quickly gained traction in several other cities. In April of 1960, the SCLC held a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, with local sit-in leaders. King encouraged students to continue to use nonviolent methods during their protests. By August of 1960, the sit-ins had been successful in ending segregation at lunch counters in 27 southern cities. In October, King himself took part in a sit-in. He and 75 students entered a local department store, requested lunch counter service, but were denied. When they refused to leave the counter area, King and 36 others were arrested. King and others took part in the Birmingham campaign of 1963, in which activists used a boycott, sit-ins, and marches to protest segregation, unfair hiring practices, and other injustices in one of America's most racially divided cities. King was arrested along with large numbers of his supporters, but the event drew nationwide attention. Later that year, Martin Luther King Jr. worked with a number of civil rights and religious groups to organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, a peaceful political rally designed to shed light on the injustices African Americans continue to face across the country. Held on August 28th and attended by some 200,000 to 300,000 participants, the event is widely regarded as a watershed moment in the history of the American Civil Rights Movement and a factor in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a monument to the president who, a century earlier, had brought down the institution of slavery in the United States, he shared his vision of a future in which this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. He also emphasized his belief that someday all men could be brothers.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The speech and march cemented King's reputation at home and abroad. Later that year, he was named Man of the Year by Time magazine, and in 1964, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, authorizing the federal government to enforce desegregation of the public accommodations and outlawing discrimination in publicly owned facilities, King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, becoming the youngest person ever awarded that prize. On March 7, 1965, a civil rights march planned from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama's capital, turned violent as police with nightsticks and tear gas met the demonstrators as they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. King was not in the march, however. The attack was televised, showing horrifying images of marchers being bloodied and severely injured. 17 demonstrators were hospitalized in a day that would be called Bloody Sunday. On March 21st, approximately 2,000 people began a march from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital. On March 25th, the number of marchers, which had grown to an estimated 25,000, gathered in front of the state capitol, where King delivered a televised speech. 5 months after the historic peaceful protest, President Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. On the evening of April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was fatally shot while standing on the balcony of a motel in Memphis, where King had traveled to support a sanitation workers' strike. In the wake of his death, a wave of riots swept major cities across the country, while President Johnson declared a national day of mourning. James Earl Ray, an escaped convict and known racist, pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He later recanted his confession and gained some unlikely advocates, including members of the King family, before his death in 1998. After years of campaigning by activists, members of Congress and Coretta Scott King, among others, in 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill creating a U.S. federal holiday in honor of King. Observed on the third Monday of January, Martin Luther King Day was first celebrated in 1986. King's life had a seismic impact on race relations in the U.S. Years after his death, he is the most widely known African American leader of his era. His life and work have been honored with a national holiday, schools and public buildings named after him, and a memorial on Independence Mall in Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and see you next time.